Somewhere beneath the sand of what we now call southern Iraq, a library was waiting. Words that describe a moment, a decision, a deliberate act of intervention into the human bloodline. Not the kind of library you're picturing. No shelves, no parchment, no candlelit reading rooms. Something far older than any of that. Thousands of small clay tablets, each one pressed with a reed stylus while the clay was still wet, then baked into a kind of permanence that paper and wood could never manage. These things survived floods. They survived fire. They survived the collapse of the very civilizations that made them. And on those tablets, in a script that took us centuries to learn how to read, were words that should probably unsettle us more than they do. That's what we're sitting with tonight. Not the loud version of this story, not the one that reaches for spectacle and trades genuine wonder for noise. The slow version, the careful one, the one that asks you to do something the ancient scribes were doing themselves when they pressed each wedge into wet clay. Pay attention. Hold a question without rushing it toward an answer. Because the question is extraordinary. Why would a creator alter his own creation? Think about what that actually means for a second, not as mythology, not as metaphor you can fold up and put away, but as a recorded claim pressed into physical objects that are sitting in museums right now. That a being called Enki looked at what humanity was and made a choice to change it, quietly, deliberately, against the wishes of the very council he answered to. What was wrong with us? Or maybe the better question, what did he see in us that no one else was willing to see? And here's the one that really stays with you, if you let it. What if that change is still inside you? I'm not asking you to believe that tonight. I'm asking you to hold it, the way you'd hold something fragile and unfamiliar before you decide what it is. Because that's really what these tablets ask of us. They don't demand belief. They demand attention. They were written by real people, living in real cities beside real rivers, breathing real air, who believed they were preserving something that mattered, something about origins, something about why humans are the particular kind of strange that we are. Overbuilt for survival, too curious for our own comfort, restless in ways that pure biology has never fully explained. They pressed it into clay so it wouldn't disappear. And here we are, thousands of years later, sitting with their words in the dark. The tablets themselves came out of the ground, mostly in the 19th century. Nineveh, Nippur, Ur, and scholars have spent generations learning to read them properly. What they found wasn't random mythology loosely assembled. It was a coherent worldview, a civilization's full attempt to understand where it came from and what it was for. And woven through that worldview, consistently, across multiple texts and multiple centuries of Sumerian and Akkadian writing, is this story. A God who helped design humanity, who understood its architecture better than anyone, who looked at the limitations built into that design and decided, quietly, to exceed them. Tonight we're going to read what was written, ask what it meant, and sit with the genuine mystery of people who looked at the stars, looked at themselves, and carved into permanence what they believed had happened to us. 4,000 years ago, maybe more, someone held a stylus over wet clay and began. We're only now learning to truly hear them. Before we can understand what Enki changed, we need to sit with what existed before. And honestly, the Sumerian answer to that question is not a comfortable one. We tend to romanticize human origins. Most traditions give us some version of a garden, a paradise, a beloved creation placed gently into a world made just for them. The Sumerian account doesn't do that. It doesn't soften the edges or wrap the beginning in golden light. It tells you something considerably more stark, and in its starkness, something that feels almost more honest. The earliest humans in Sumerian cosmology were called the Lulu. It's a word that translates roughly as the primitive worker, or the mixed one. Neither translation is particularly flattering, and that's the point, because the Lulu was not created from love, or longing, or divine delight in a new kind of being. The Lulu was created from a problem that needed solving. Here's the problem. The Anunnaki, those elder divine beings who governed the operations of Earth in the Sumerian worldview, had a workforce. Lesser divine beings called the Igigi, tasked with the physical labor of maintaining earthly systems, digging canals, working the land, keeping the whole operation running. And for a very long time, they did. Then they stopped. The texts describe it plainly. The Igigi had been laboring for so long, under conditions so relentless, that they finally set down their tools, burned their equipment, surrounded the great house of Enlil, the chief administrator of Earth, and refused to continue. A full divine labor revolt. And the council, suddenly facing the collapse of everything their earthly operation depended on, needed a solution. The solution was the Lulu, a being that could carry the workload, that could dig and harvest and build and maintain. Functional enough to serve, limited enough to manage. The Atrahasis Epic, one of the oldest and most carefully studied texts in the Mesopotamian record, describes this with a directness that is almost clinical. Humanity was made to bear the yoke of the gods. That's the language the text uses, not beloved children, not junior partners in a cosmic project, a workforce, a substitute for the workers who had revolted. Now sit with that framing for a moment, really sit with it, because what it means is that the limitations placed on early humanity were not oversights. They weren't the result of divine inexperience or incomplete craftsmanship. They were deliberate. Someone in that council drew a line and made a decision. This being needs to be capable enough to work and constrained enough not to question why. Short lifespans, restricted consciousness, no access to the me, those divine gifts of civilization that would eventually include writing, music, mathematics, kingship, the capacity for deep wisdom. The early Lulu existed in a carefully managed space between animal and divine, close enough to function in the divine operation, far enough from transcendence to remain controllable. Picture that world, if you can. Beings waking before dawn to labor in fields and canals under a Mesopotamian sky. Capable of effort, capable of feeling, capable of enough awareness to follow instruction, but not yet equipped with the full range of what human consciousness would eventually become, existing in a kind of twilight, present but not fully arrived. This is the baseline. This is the before. This is what Enki looked at, and something in what he saw, something in the gap between what the Lulu was and what he perhaps understood it could be, set in motion everything we're going to explore tonight. The question isn't just what he changed, it's what he noticed, that no one else was willing to acknowledge. If we're going to understand why the human bloodline was changed, we need to spend real time with the one who changed it, not the textbook version, not a dry list of attributes pulled from a mythology index. The actual character that emerges when you read through thousands of years of Sumerian literature and ask, who is this being really? What does he consistently care about? What does he do when no one is watching? Because Enki, more than almost any figure in ancient mythology, has a personality. A recognizable, consistent, almost frustratingly human personality that shows up the same way across centuries of separate texts written by different scribes in different cities. He is brilliant. That part everyone agrees on. Lord of the Abzu, the great primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, and god of wisdom, craft, magic, and what the Sumerians called Namzu, deep knowledge, not surface knowledge, not the kind of knowing that comes from being told things, the kind that comes from understanding how things actually work at their foundation. He is inventive. When problems arise in the divine order, Enki is almost always the one called upon to solve them. Not through force, that's Enlil's domain, through cleverness, through lateral thinking, through finding the solution no one else thought to look for, and he delights in it. That's the thing that keeps coming through in the texts. He genuinely enjoys the act of making and fixing and creating. There's a playfulness to him that the other major Anunnaki figures simply don't have. But here's what matters most for tonight's story. Enki likes humans, not in an abstract, administrative sense, not the way a craftsman appreciates a well-functioning tool, something warmer than that, something that reads across text after text as genuine affection, genuine curiosity about what humanity is and what it could become. When the divine council debates humanity's fate, and they debate it often and rarely in humanity's favor, Enki is consistently the voice arguing for protection, for preservation, for giving humans more time, more capacity, more of a chance. When Enlil grows tired of human complexity and human noise and human refusal to stay neatly within their designated boundaries, it is Enki who finds quiet ways to ensure they survive anyway. This pattern is so consistent across the literature that it cannot be accidental. The Sumerian scribes were painting a portrait with intention, a being of supreme intelligence and technical mastery, who holds a position of genuine power within a divine hierarchy, and who repeatedly, at real personal risk, chooses humanity's side. Why? That question is going to occupy us for a while tonight. But before we get there, there's one more thing about Enki worth sitting with. His city, Eridu, located at the southernmost tip of ancient Mesopotamia, on the edge of the Persian Gulf as it existed thousands of years ago. And here is what archaeology tells us about Eridu with remarkable confidence. It is almost certainly the oldest city on Earth. The first. The place where urban human civilization began. Enki's city, the god of deep wisdom, and the first city humans ever built. The Sumerians did not consider that a coincidence. They considered it the whole point, that the flowering of human civilization, writing, mathematics, architecture, law, music, the entire complex apparatus of what we call culture, emerged first in the city of the god who cared most about what humanity could become. Whether you read that as theology or history or something in between, it is a remarkable thing to sit with. To really feel the weight of what Enki did, you have to first understand what he was working against, because the Anunnaki, as the Sumerian texts present them, were not chaotic. They were not careless. They were not divine beings stumbling through creation without a plan. They were, if anything, the opposite of that, ordered, hierarchical, deeply invested in systems that functioned according to established purpose. They built things the way engineers build infrastructure, with a clear understanding of what each component is meant to do and what it is absolutely not meant to do. Humanity was a component. and the original design for that component was precise. The Atrahasis Epic lays this out without softening it. The gods were burdened. The Igigi had revolted. A solution was needed urgently, and the solution that emerged from the council's deliberation was the creation of a substitute labor force, a being capable enough to perform complex physical work, but contained enough to remain within the boundaries of its designated function. That last part is the part worth holding, contained enough to remain within the boundaries of its designated function. This wasn't accidental limitation. It wasn't the result of divine craftsmanship falling short of its own ambitions. The constraints built into the original Lulu were architectural decisions, policy. The council looked at what they needed, and they built exactly that, no more. Think about what those constraints actually meant in practice. Short lifespans. A being that lives briefly does not accumulate enough experience to develop genuine wisdom. It cannot build knowledge across generations in the way that long-lived beings can. It remains, in a meaningful sense, perpetually young, perpetually manageable. Each new generation starting close to where the last one started, never quite getting far enough to become something the council hadn't anticipated. Restricted cognitive capacity. The early Lulu could follow instruction, could learn tasks, could operate within systems designed by others. But the deeper capacities, abstract thought, philosophical reflection, the ability to step outside immediate experience and question the structure of reality itself, these appear to have been withheld, deliberately. A workforce doesn't need to ask why it exists. It needs to show up and work. No access to the me. Those divine gifts of civilization, writing, mathematics, music, law, the instruments of complex culture, were held in Enki's Abzu, carefully stored, not yet transmitted to the human population. The Lulu was functional, but it was not yet civilized, not in the full sense of that word. What you get when you add these constraints together is a being in permanent suspension, capable of just enough to be useful, and limited in precisely the ways that prevented it from becoming anything more than useful. Enlil, in particular, seems to have been comfortable with this arrangement, more than comfortable, invested in it. The texts paint him as a figure who views human management as an ongoing administrative responsibility, and who grows increasingly frustrated as humanity, despite the original design, keeps pressing against its own boundaries. Multiplying beyond projected numbers, growing louder, more complex, more difficult to govern cleanly, he wanted a workforce. What he was beginning to get was something else. And somewhere in that gap, between the contained Lulu the council had designed and the restless, expanding humanity that kept emerging anyway, Enki was watching, understanding exactly why the gap existed, knowing, better than anyone, what would be required to close it, not by pushing humanity back within the original boundaries, but by redrawing them entirely. We should stop here for a moment and be honest about something. Everything we're discussing tonight, every scene, every character, every claim about divine counsels and deliberate human limitation, comes from specific physical objects, real things, things you could, if you arranged the right permissions and traveled to the right cities, stand in front of and look at directly through museum glass. This is not folklore passed mouth to mouth across campfires until the original shape of it dissolved into something unrecognizable. This is not legend polished smooth by centuries of retelling until only the comfortable parts remained. What we are working with tonight are primary sources, pressed into clay, baked into permanence, surviving against extraordinary odds into our present moment. And that matters. It matters a great deal. The Atrahasis Epic, the Enuma Elish, the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian King List, hundreds of hymns, temple records, administrative texts, and mythological compositions spread across collections in London, Paris, Philadelphia, Istanbul, and Baghdad. These are the foundation of tonight's story, not interpretation built on interpretation, built on someone's creative reading of a vague source. Actual tablets, actual words, actual claims pressed into the permanent record by people who believed they were writing something worth preserving. The cuneiform script itself, those wedge-shaped impressions that look almost like abstract mark-making to modern eyes, encodes one of the oldest written languages on Earth. Sumerian first, then Akkadian, the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, which absorbed and transmitted much of the Sumerian cosmological tradition as Babylon rose to prominence. Scholars began seriously cracking this script in the 19th century, after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone opened the broader door to ancient language decipherment. It took generations of painstaking work, brilliant, obsessive, career-defining work by people who dedicated their lives to learning to hear what these tablets were saying. What they found, when they could finally read them properly, was not a random collection of disconnected myths. It was a worldview, a coherent, internally consistent cosmological system, a civilization's full attempt to record and transmit its understanding of origins, divine structure, human purpose, and the relationship between what is above and what is below. The Sumerians were not primitive people telling simple stories around fires. They were sophisticated thinkers, encoding complex theology into a written tradition that would influence every major civilization that came after them. Babylonian, Assyrian, Hebrew, Greek, and beyond, and embedded within that system, in multiple texts, from multiple periods, with a consistency that serious scholars have spent careers documenting, is the account we are sitting with tonight. The Atrahasis Epic is perhaps the most directly relevant. Dated in its surviving form to approximately 1700 BCE, it is widely understood to preserve oral and written traditions considerably older than that. It contains the most complete account of human creation, divine conflict, and the flood, and within it, the framework for understanding why humanity was made, how it was made, and what happened when that original making was altered. The Enuma Elish provides the cosmological architecture. The Sumerian King List provides the genealogical record. The hymns addressed to Enki directly fill in the character and motivation. Read separately. Each text is remarkable. Read together. They tell a story that has been waiting, pressed into clay, for someone patient enough to hear it whole. We are that patient tonight. Let us step into the moment now, not around it, not above it at a safe scholarly distance, into it. Because the Sumerian texts, when they describe what Enki did, are not vague. They are not gesturing loosely at divine mystery and asking you to fill in the rest. They are specific, procedural, almost. And that specificity is exactly what makes them so difficult to simply file away as mythology and move on from. The location matters. The texts describe a place of creation, a bit mummy, which translates as something like a house of formation, a house of destiny, a chamber, not a cosmic void, not an abstract divine space beyond description, a location, a specific place where specific things were done with specific materials by specific hands. Enki does not act alone. Working alongside him is the mother goddess, called Ninhursag in some texts, Mami in others, Ninma in others still. Different names across different periods and different cities, but a consistent identity, the divine midwife, the one in whose capacity for creation the final act of human formation takes place. Enki provides the knowledge and the intention. She provides the womb through which that intention becomes a living thing. The materials are described. Clay, tit in Sumerian, taken from the earth. This much was present in the original Lulu creation. Clay has always been the base, the physical substrate from which the human form is fashioned. But clay alone is inert. Clay alone is just earth. What animates it, what makes it human rather than simply shaped mud, is what gets mixed into it. And here's where the texts become extraordinary, the blood of a divine being. In some versions, a god who volunteers. In others, one who is specifically chosen. The Te'ima, that untranslatable Sumerian word that scholars render variously as spirit, personality, or the essential informational pattern of a conscious being, is extracted and combined with the clay. The divine blueprint folded into the physical material. The pattern of what a god is, embedded into the substance of what a human would become. This is the original creation. This is the Lulu as the council designed it. But what the broader record suggests, across the Atrahasis, across the hymns to Enki, across the accumulated texture of Sumerian cosmological literature, is that when Enki entered that chamber for the act that concerns us tonight, he introduced something beyond the authorized specification. He understood the architecture of the human design better than anyone alive because he had helped build it. He knew exactly where the limitations had been placed and exactly what removing them would require. And in that chamber, with steady hands and a clear understanding of what he was doing and why, he changed the ratios. More divine inheritance folded into the clay, a greater proportion of Te'ema, the ceiling on human consciousness quietly raised, the lifespan parameters quietly extended, the capacity for wisdom, for transcendence, for direct relationship with the divine order, quietly, carefully, deliberately installed into a being that the council had specifically designed to lack them. No announcement, no petition to the council for amended authorization, no negotiation with Enlil, just the work, done in the careful way that the most consequential things are always done, not with thunder and proclamation, but with patient hands in a quiet room and a complete understanding of what was being changed and what that change would eventually mean. The clay received it, and humanity was never quite what the council had intended again. So what did Enki actually place inside us? The Sumerian texts don't answer this in a single clean passage. There's no moment where Enki turns to the camera, so to speak, and itemizes the modification. What we have, instead, is something more interesting. A picture assembled from dozens of texts, hymns, king lists, and cosmological compositions that, taken together, point toward three distinct dimensions of what was altered in the human bloodline. And each one, when you really look at it, maps onto something you can still observe in human beings today. The first is time. The Sumerian King List, that remarkable clay prism now sitting in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, records the reigns of pre-flood kings in numbers that stop modern readers cold. Tens of thousands of years, some reigns exceeding 40,000 years. Scholars have long categorized these figures as mythological excess. Scribal symbolism, numbers too large to be taken literally. But within the internal logic of the Sumerian system, these numbers mean something specific. They represent the concentration of divine inheritance in those early bloodlines. Beings carrying a greater proportion of Te'ema, that divine essential pattern, would naturally exist closer to the timescale of the gods themselves, longer lived, more durable against the erosion of time. The pre-flood kings weren't living impossibly long lives as literary metaphor. They were, in the Sumerian worldview, living exactly as long as their elevated inheritance allowed. After the flood, the reigns shortened sharply, hundreds of years, then decades, the dilution of the bloodline, written into the mathematics of the list itself. The second dimension is mind. Enki is, before anything else, the god of wisdom. His domain is deep knowledge, not information, but understanding. The capacity to perceive how things actually work beneath their surfaces. And what the texts consistently associate with his particular investment in humanity is the gradual awakening of exactly this capacity in human beings. Abstract thought, symbolic reasoning, the ability to step outside immediate experience and reflect on it, to ask not just what, but why, to look at the night sky and feel not just cold and darkness, but something like longing, something like recognition. These qualities, which separate human cognition from every other form of animal consciousness on this planet in ways that still puzzle evolutionary biologists, are, in the Sumerian framework, Enki's fingerprints, placed deliberately, designed to activate. The third dimension is the most quietly profound: connection. The altered bloodline carried within it what later Mesopotamian tradition would describe as the capacity for personal God relationship. The sense that each human being had a divine advocate, a point of genuine contact with the larger intelligence of the universe. Not just worship directed upward into silence, but an actual channel, a two-way relationship between the human and the divine that the original Lulu design appears to have deliberately excluded. Think about what that means. The original workforce was designed to serve gods it could not truly reach. The altered humanity was given the capacity to know them, to participate in the divine order rather than simply maintain it from below. 3 changes: time, mind, connection. And if you sit quietly for a moment and ask yourself what makes human beings the particular kind of strange that we are: restless, long-reaching, never quite satisfied with the boundaries of what is known. These 3 things cover most of the answer. Now we reach the question the whole story has been quietly building toward. Why? Not how, not what. Why? Because the how is documented in the tablets and we've walked through it carefully. The what is assembled from the texts and we've examined each dimension of it. But the why is where this story stops being ancient history and starts being something more personally uncomfortable, something that asks you to sit with a question that doesn't resolve cleanly. Why would a being of supreme intelligence, holding genuine power within a divine hierarchy that had clear rules and clear consequences for breaking them, choose to alter humanity beyond its authorized design? Why secret action instead of open petition? Why transgression instead of advocacy through proper channels? The texts don't hand you a single answer. Enki doesn't deliver a speech explaining his motivation. What we have instead is what we always have with the deepest human and apparently divine motivations: a portrait built from behavior, from pattern, from what someone consistently chooses across time when the stakes are real. And that portrait, when you sit with it honestly, points towards several things operating simultaneously. The first is something that feels almost embarrassingly simple to name. He saw something in us. not what we were, what we could be. Enki looked at the Lulu, that carefully constrained, deliberately limited labor being, and perceived inside it a potential that the council either couldn't see or chose not to acknowledge. The capacity for wisdom sleeping inside a design that had been specifically engineered to keep it dormant, and for a being whose entire nature was oriented toward deep knowledge and the recognition of hidden potential in things. That gap between what humanity was and what it could become may simply have been intolerable to him. The second motivation the text suggests is something closer to long vision. Enki's characteristic wisdom operates on timescales the other Anunnaki don't seem to share. He thinks further ahead. He considers consequences at distances that shorter-sighted governance doesn't reach. And he may have understood something about the trajectory of Earth and civilization that made an elevated humanity not just compassionate, but necessary. A species of permanent laborers would plateau, serve its function, exhaust its usefulness, end. A species carrying genuine divine inheritance would grow into something that could participate meaningfully in whatever the long future of this world required. Enki may not have been acting against the council's interests so much as acting beyond their capacity to perceive what those interests actually were. The third thing, and this is the one that sits most quietly but cuts most deeply, is what we might simply call love. The Sumerian texts are remarkably consistent in portraying Enki's relationship with humanity as something beyond administrative responsibility. There is warmth in how he speaks about humans. There is genuine distress in how he responds when they are threatened. There is something in the accumulated portrait that exceeds any functional explanation and lands, if you let it, in the territory of genuine care. He altered us because he cared what we became, not what we produced, not what we could deliver to the divine operation, what we became. And perhaps that is the most radical thing the Sumerian record preserves, not the fact of the alteration, but the motivation behind it, the idea that somewhere in the deep history of this species, a decision was made on our behalf by someone who looked at our limitations and found them unacceptable, who decided quietly that we deserved more than we had been given. Not everyone was moved by what Enki had done, not even close. When the extent of the alteration became apparent to the divine council, and it did become apparent because you cannot keep the consequences of expanded human consciousness quiet for very long, the response was not wonder. It was not gratitude that someone had seen deeper potential in the creation and acted on it. The response was anger, sustained, escalating, politically complex anger directed at both the humans who were now exceeding their designed limitations, and the God who had exceeded his authority to give them the means to do it. Enlil's reaction runs through the Sumerian and Akkadian texts like a fault line. You can trace it across multiple compositions, watching it intensify as humanity keeps growing in ways that the original design had specifically precluded. The Atrahasis Epic is particularly direct about this. Humanity had become numerous. The word the text uses, that charged, weighted Sumerian word for human complexity and noise, begins appearing with increasing urgency in Enlil's pronouncements. Humans were expanding, multiplying beyond projected numbers, building things that had not been requested, asking questions that should not have been possible given their original specifications, living longer than the design allowed, growing louder, more complex, more difficult to govern within the clean administrative categories that Enlil preferred. And Enlil, being Enlil, responded the way a systems administrator responds when a component starts behaving outside its programmed parameters. He tried to correct it. The first attempts were targeted. Disease sent among the human population. A plague intended to reduce numbers and complexity back to manageable levels. It didn't hold. Enki, characteristically, quietly taught human beings how to propitiate the relevant divine forces and survive the affliction. The population recovered, the complexity continued, then drought, then famine, systematic reductions in the earthly conditions that supported human flourishing. Each time, the same pattern. Enlil applies pressure. Enki finds a way to help humanity adapt. The correction fails, and Enlil's frustration deepens another degree. What is remarkable about this sequence, and worth sitting with, is what it reveals about the nature of the conflict. This was not a minor administrative disagreement between two divine officials with different management styles. This was a fundamental collision between two incompatible visions of what humanity was for. Enlil saw a workforce that had malfunctioned, a component operating outside its intended parameters, a problem requiring correction back toward original specification. Enki saw something that was finally, slowly, becoming what it had always had the potential to be. Neither of them was wrong about the facts. Humanity had changed. Humanity was exceeding its original design. The disagreement was entirely about whether that was a problem to be solved or a development to be protected. And what the texts make clear is that this disagreement could not be resolved through deliberation. The council could not find a middle position between these two visions, because the visions were not different points on a spectrum. They were contradictory answers to the same question. What is a human being for? The council's inability to resolve that question through policy would eventually produce the most extreme response in the entire Sumerian record. A flood that was meant to answer it once and for all. And so, the council made its decision. Not hastily, not in a moment of impulsive divine rage. The texts suggest something considerably more deliberate than that. A formal resolution, reached after the repeated failures of plague and drought and famine to restore humanity to its original parameters. A council that had exhausted its corrective options and arrived, with cold administrative logic, at the conclusion that correction was no longer possible. If you cannot reset the component, you replace it entirely. The flood in the Sumerian record is not the flood most of us grew up with. It is not primarily a moral story. It is not heaven's punishment for human wickedness in the way that later traditions, the Hebrew Bible most prominently, would reframe it. The Atrahasis Epic, which preserves the oldest and most complete Mesopotamian version of the event, is remarkably clear about the actual reason. Noise, that word again, that charged weighted Sumerian concept that means so much more than sound. Human complexity, human autonomy, the sheer overwhelming presence of a species that had grown beyond every boundary its creators had set for it. Humanity wasn't being destroyed for being evil. It was being destroyed for being too much, for becoming, through Enki's unauthorized intervention, something the council had never sanctioned and could no longer contain. Sit with the full weight of that for a moment. The flood was not punishment. It was erasure, a deliberate council-authorized attempt to wipe the altered bloodline from existence and return the earth to a condition the divine administration could manage. To undo, in one catastrophic act, everything that Enki's quiet work in that chamber had set in motion. It was, in the most direct sense, an attempt to reverse the bloodline change. And the scale of what was decided tells you something important about how seriously the council took the threat. These were not beings who resorted to extinction-level intervention casually. The repeated attempts at targeted correction, disease, drought, famine, demonstrate that erasure was a last resort, which means that by the time the flood decision was made, the council had concluded that Enki's modification had taken too deep a hold to be addressed by any lesser measure. The altered humanity had become too resilient, too adaptive, too capable of surviving what was thrown at it, because Enki had made it that way. There is a terrible irony embedded in this sequence that the Sumerian scribes seem to have understood and preserved deliberately. The very qualities that made Enki's modified humans worth saving were the qualities that kept surviving every attempt to destroy them, right up until the moment when the attempt became total. The consciousness that asked why. The extended lifespan that accumulated wisdom across generations. The divine connection that gave human beings access to knowledge and guidance beyond their own immediate experience. These were not incidental features of the alteration. They were precisely what made the altered bloodline dangerous in Enlil's eyes. And they were precisely what kept it alive through every corrective measure short of the flood itself. The water came. The texts describe it with a scale and totality that leaves no ambiguity about intent. This was not a regional disaster. This was a decision. A divine council's final answer to the question of what to do with a creation that had exceeded its authorized design. The answer was to drown it, and it almost worked. Almost. That word is doing enormous work in this story, because the flood did not accomplish what the council intended, not because it failed as a physical event. By all accounts in the Sumerian record, the devastation was total. The world as humanity had built it was gone. The cities, the temples, the accumulated knowledge of generations of altered human beings, submerged, silenced, returned to the formless condition that existed before civilization had a chance to take root. And yet, one family survived, one bloodline, one carefully chosen vessel of continuity that carried everything Enki had placed into the human inheritance across the waters and into the world that came after. His name, in the oldest Sumerian version of the story, was Ziusudra. In the Akkadian tradition, he becomes Utnapishtim. In yet another version, Atrahasis, the same name as the epic itself, meaning exceedingly wise. Different names, same essential figure. A man of specific qualities, chosen deliberately, warned in secret, and preserved against the explicit intention of the council that had just voted for humanity's extinction. The warning itself is worth examining closely. Because it is pure Enki, the council had bound its members to silence. The decision to flood was final, and the humans were not to be warned. That was the agreement. Enki, characteristically, honored the letter of that agreement while completely dismantling its spirit. He did not warn Ziusudra directly. He spoke to a reed wall. He addressed his words to the woven reeds of a hut, describing in careful detail what was coming and what needed to be built to survive it. And Ziusudra listened through the wall. Technically, no divine rule had been broken. No human had been warned. A wall had been spoken to. What the wall's inhabitant chose to do with the information it overheard was, strictly speaking, not Enki's responsibility. It is almost funny, except that the survival of our entire species depended on it. But the question we need to sit with tonight goes deeper than the mechanics of the warning. The question is why Ziusudra, specifically. Of all the human beings alive in that moment, and there were many because the altered bloodline had been multiplying for generations. Why this one? What was it about this particular man and this particular lineage that made Enki choose them as the vessel of everything that mattered? The texts point towards something consistent with everything we have been exploring. Ziusudra, that was not simply a good person in a moral sense, though the texts describe him as righteous. He was, within the Sumerian cosmological framework, a concentrated carrier of the modified inheritance, the elevated consciousness, the extended capacity, the divine connection. He represented, in a single bloodline, the fullest expression of what Enki had placed into humanity in that chamber long before the flood was ever contemplated. He was, in the most literal sense, the best evidence of what the alteration had produced. By preserving Ziusudra, Enki was not simply saving a life, he was making a statement, a quiet, undeniable, permanent statement pressed into the future of the world itself. The modification continues. The bloodline carries forward, through the waters, through the silence, through the long rebuilding of everything the flood had taken. What Enki placed inside us, the council could not drown. After the flood waters receded, and the earth slowly returned to stillness, something remarkable happened. Kingship descended from heaven. That is the exact language the Sumerian King List uses. Not a metaphor anyone seems to have felt needed explaining. Not a poetic flourish added later by scribes who wanted to elevate the political authority of their rulers. A direct, matter-of-fact statement pressed into clay as historical record. Kingship, the right and capacity to govern, to organize, to stand at the intersection of human and divine and mediate between them, came down from above and settled, deliberately, on specific human beings. The King List itself is an extraordinary object, preserved most completely on a clay prism now housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It catalogues the rulers of Mesopotamia from the earliest pre-flood period through the early historical era. It reads, in parts, like a perfectly normal administrative record: names, cities, lengths of reign, transitions of power. The kind of document that ancient bureaucracies produced as a matter of governance and memory, except for the numbers. The pre-flood section of the King List contains reigns of staggering, almost incomprehensible length. Alulim of Eridu, Enki's city, notice, ruled for 28,800 years. Alalangar ruled for 36,000. Enmenlu-Ana for 43,200. 8 kings ruling across 5 cities before the flood, with combined reigns totaling hundreds of thousands of years. Modern scholarship has largely treated these numbers as mythology, symbolic inflation designed to communicate the antiquity and divine sanction of early kingship, rather than actual chronological data. And that interpretation is reasonable. It is defensible. It is the responsible scholarly position. But hold it alongside the Sumerian cosmological framework we have been building all evening, and something else becomes visible. Within the internal logic of the system, the logic of divine inheritance, of Te-Ama concentration, of Enki's bloodline alteration creating human beings who existed closer to the divine timescale. These numbers are not mythology dressed as history. They are history expressed in cosmological terms. The pre-flood kings were not ordinary human beings. They were, in the Sumerian understanding, the direct carriers of the unmodified alteration, the first and most concentrated inheritors of what Enki had placed into the human bloodline before the flood diluted and dispersed it. Longer lived because they carried more capacious because the divine inheritance in them had not yet been thinned by generations of post-flood repopulation. Closer to the gods in timescale because they were, quite literally, closer to the gods in constitution, and then the flood came, and Ziusudra survived, and the world repopulated from that single preserved bloodline. Watch what happens to the rains after the flood. The numbers drop immediately and dramatically. The first post-flood king on the list, Jushur of Kish, reigned for 1,200 years. Still extraordinary by modern standards, but a fraction of what came before. And as the list continues forward in time, the reigns keep shrinking. Hundreds of years become decades. Decades become normal human lifespans. The great rulers of the early dynastic period, figures whose historical existence archaeology has actually confirmed, reign for lengths of time we would recognize as plausible. The dilution of the bloodline written into the mathematics of a single clay document. What the King List appears to be preserving, whether its authors understood it in precisely these terms or not, is a record of the altered inheritance thinning across time. The divine concentration that Enki had placed into the human bloodline spreading outward through each successive generation, each new branching of the post-flood family tree, until what had once been extraordinary became ordinary. But here's the thing that the King List also preserves, quietly, in its very structure. The kingship did not disappear. The capacity for governance, for wisdom, for standing at the intersection of human and divine did not vanish when the lifespan shortened. It persisted. It adapted. It moved through history in different vessels, at different concentrations, expressing itself in different ways across different eras and different civilizations. The inheritance thinned, but it did not end. And perhaps that is the most important thing the King List is actually telling us. Not that the gods once walked among us in human form and ruled for thousands of years, but that something placed into the human bloodline long before the flood found a way to keep moving forward. Through every king, every scribe, every builder of cities and composer of hymns and asker of unanswerable questions about the nature of existence, all the way to here, all the way to you, there is something the Sumerian texts preserve about Enki's intervention that goes beyond biology, beyond lifespan and cognitive capacity and divine connection. Something that connects the bloodline changed directly to a phenomenon you can actually see in the archaeological record, if you know what you're looking at, the me. This Sumerian word has no clean English translation. Scholars have spent careers circling it. Divine gifts, cosmic laws, the fundamental decrees of civilization, the essential transmissible codes of complex human society. None of these phrases fully captures what the Sumerians meant when they used it. But taken together, they begin to point towards something real. The me were the building blocks of everything we recognize as civilization. Writing, mathematics, kingship, music, the crafts of weaving and metalwork, the descent into the underworld and the ascent back from it, the laws of justice, the instruments of lamentation, the art of the scribe, the capacity for heroism, the knowledge of how to build a city and why a city needs to exist at all. In the Sumerian cosmological system, these were not things that human beings invented gradually through trial and error across long stretches of prehistoric time. They were not the slow accumulations of adaptive intelligence finding better and better solutions to practical problems. They were gifts, specific, innumerable, transmissible gifts that existed as discrete entities in Enki's Abzu, his great underground domain of deep water and deeper knowledge, waiting to be released into the human world at the appropriate moment. And Enki was their keeper. The famous myth of Inanna and the Me captures this beautifully. The goddess of love and war travels to Eridu, Enki's city, the first city, and shares a great feast with the god of wisdom. Enki, in a moment of divine generosity that the texts describe with considerable warmth and perhaps a trace of humor, begins presenting Inanna with me after me. Kingship, descent into the underworld, the noble art of music, the art of heroism, truth, the standard, the quiver, sexual intercourse, prostitution, the holy tavern. It is a remarkable list, sacred and profane together, without apology, because in the Sumerian worldview, civilization in its fullness contains all of it. Inanna loads these gifts onto her boat and carries them to her city of Uruk. Enki, apparently sobering up and reconsidering the scale of his generosity, sends servants to retrieve them. Inanna keeps them. Uruk receives the gifts of civilization, and the world is changed. It is a wonderful story. But what the surrounding literature suggests is something deeper than a tale about divine gift-giving and divine regret. The Me were not simply cultural technologies handed to humans from outside. They were capacities that humans with the altered bloodline had become ready to receive. The modification Enki made in that chamber, the expanded consciousness, the elevated cognitive ceiling, the divine connection, did not operate in isolation from the Me. It created in humanity an aptitude, a readiness, a cognitive and spiritual architecture that could actually hold these gifts and use them meaningfully. Think about what that means in practical terms. Writing does not appear randomly in human history. It appears in Sumer. Specifically, it appears first in Eridu and Uruk, the cities most directly associated with Enki's cultural sphere. The earliest known written symbols, pressed into clay tablets at Uruk around 3400 BCE, are administrative records. Accounting, the management of complex resources across complex social structures. Exactly the kind of cognitive task that requires the abstract symbolic reasoning that Enki's modification had installed into the human bloodline. Mathematics follows the same pattern. Astronomy, the capacity for architectural planning at scale, the development of legal codes sophisticated enough to govern cities of tens of thousands of people, all of it emerging first in the same geographic and cultural sphere, all of it requiring exactly the cognitive capacities that the altered bloodline carried. This is not proof of anything, to be fair. Correlation is not causation, and the honest scholar acknowledges that, but it is a pattern, a persistent, geographically concentrated, temporally specific pattern that the Sumerian texts themselves offer a direct explanation for. The Me did not fall on random soil. They fell on soil that had been prepared to receive them, prepared by a modification made long before the first city rose, by a god who apparently understood exactly what kind of mind would be required to build one. Enki did not just change the bloodline and walk away. He changed it, and then spent the rest of the mythological record making sure that what the changed bloodline was now capable of receiving actually arrived. The alteration and the gifts were never separate things. They were always two halves of a single intention. The bloodline change created the vessel. The Me filled it. And what was poured into that vessel became everything we call human civilization. Here is something worth sitting with before we go any further. The Sumerian account of Enki's intervention in the human bloodline is remarkable on its own terms. We have established that. The specificity of the texts, the consistency of the character across thousands of years of literature, the way the account holds together as a coherent system rather than scattered mythology. Any one of those qualities would make this story worth serious attention. But the Sumerian account does not stand alone. And that is where things get genuinely interesting. Because when you step back from Mesopotamia and look at the broader landscape of ancient human civilization, not cherry-picking, not forcing connections that aren't there, but genuinely reading the primary traditions of cultures separated by geography and millennia, a pattern emerges that is difficult to simply explain away. Across cultures that had no documented contact with each other, across traditions that developed independently on different continents in different eras, the same essential story keeps surfacing. A wise deity, technically skilled and deeply knowledgeable, intervenes in human development against the indifference or active opposition of a larger divine order. Something powerful and transformative is given to humanity that was not supposed to be given. The intervention is unauthorized, the consequences are permanent, and the being who did it paid a price for the transgression. Let's move slowly through this, because the connections deserve care. In ancient Egypt, the figure of Thoth occupies a role that serious scholars of comparative mythology have long noted runs parallel to Enki's with striking consistency. Thoth is the ibis-headed deity of wisdom, writing, mathematics, and cosmic knowledge. He is the divine record keeper, the measurer of time, the one who stands at the boundary between human understanding and divine mystery and mediates between them. Most significantly for our purposes, he is the deity most consistently associated in Egyptian texts with the elevation of human intellectual capacity, with the transmission of knowledge to humanity that other divine figures either could not or would not provide. The parallels to Enki are not superficial. They run through the core of both figures' mythological identities. Both are gods of wisdom and craft. Both are associated with writing as a divine gift to humanity. Both occupy a mediating position between human and divine that the other major deities of their respective pantheons do not share. Both are depicted as genuinely invested in human flourishing in ways that exceed administrative duty. Whether this represents cultural diffusion, Sumerian ideas traveling to Egypt through the broad networks of ancient Near Eastern contact, or whether both traditions are independently encoding the memory of something real, is a question worth sitting with rather than rushing to answer. Then there is the Greek tradition, Prometheus, Titan, culture hero. The being who looked at cold, fire-lit humanity struggling in the darkness and made a choice that the Olympian Council had explicitly forbidden. He stole fire from the gods, carried it down to the human world, gave it to creatures who were not supposed to have it, and was punished for it with a severity that makes the punishment itself a kind of testament to how seriously the divine order took the transgression. Chained to a rock, an eagle consuming his liver daily, the wound healing each night, the consumption beginning again each morning. An eternal consequence for an act of unauthorized, divine generosity toward human beings. The structural parallel to Enki's story is almost precise. A divine being with specific technical knowledge, an unauthorized gift to humanity, a governing divine council that views the gift as a dangerous transgression, permanent consequences for the giver, and a humanity transformed by what it received. The Vedic tradition of ancient India adds another layer. The Ashvins, divine twin physicians of extraordinary wisdom and skill, repeatedly elevate human capacity in ways that attract the jealousy and opposition of Indra, the king of the gods. They restore sight to the blind. They give knowledge to the worthy that the divine hierarchy considers above human station. They operate consistently at the edge of what is divinely permitted, always on humanity's side, always pushing the boundary of what humans are allowed to receive. Prajapati, the Vedic lord of creatures, creates humanity and maintains an ongoing investment in human development that other divine figures simply do not share. The pattern, wise deity, unauthorized elevation, divine opposition, runs through the Vedic material with the same structural consistency we find in Sumer. Now, what do we do with all of this? The intellectually honest answer is, we hold it carefully. We do not collapse these traditions into a single narrative, as if all ancient cultures were secretly saying the same thing in different costumes. They were not. Each tradition has its own internal logic, its own cultural context, its own reasons for telling the stories it tells. Forcing them into artificial unity does violence to all of them. But we also do not look away from the pattern, because the pattern is real. And real patterns in independent data sets are always asking a question worth hearing. What if these traditions are not inventing the same story coincidentally? What if they are each, in their own language and their own cultural framework, encoding the memory of something that actually happened, something that was experienced differently by different peoples in different places? But that left the same essential shape in the stories they told about their own origins. A moment when something was given to humanity that changed what humanity could become. A being who gave it. A price that was paid. The Sumerians called him Enki. The Egyptians called him Thoth. The Greeks called him Prometheus. The Vedic tradition distributed the role across several figures rather than concentrating it in one. But the gift is always the same: knowledge, capacity, elevation beyond the original design. And the question that all of these traditions are quietly, persistently asking across thousands of years of human memory is whether what was given can ever truly be taken back. We should pause here and be honest about where we are standing. Because everything we have explored tonight, the Lulu, the chamber, the altered bloodline, the council's rage, the flood as erasure, the preserved lineage, the pattern across civilizations, all of it exists within a landscape of serious academic debate. And that debate deserves our genuine respect. Not a polite nod before we dismiss it and continue. Genuine respect. Because the scholars who have devoted their careers to these texts have earned the right to be heard carefully. So let's hear them. Mainstream academic archaeology and ancient Near Eastern studies, the field represented by institutions like the Oriental Institute in Chicago, the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania's Near Eastern Languages Department, approaches the Sumerian mythological corpus with a framework that is consistent, carefully reasoned, and supported by more than a century of serious excavation and linguistic scholarship. In this framework, the Atrahasis Epic, the Enuma Elish, the Sumerian King List, and the hymns to Enki are understood as exactly what they appear to be at one level of reading. Sophisticated religious and literary texts produced by a complex civilization to explain its origins, justify its social structures, and transmit its cosmological worldview across generations. The gods are theological constructs. The creation narratives are mythological explanations for observable human qualities. Our capacity for wisdom, our restlessness, our sense of connection to something larger than ourselves. Enki's alteration of the human bloodline is, in this reading, a narrative metaphor, a story that answers the question every civilization eventually asks: why are we the way we are? This is a serious position, held by serious people, backed by serious evidence, and it would be intellectually dishonest to pretend otherwise. But then there is the other tradition, less institutionally housed, more contested, more willing to follow the texts somewhere that mainstream scholarship is not comfortable going. The alternative interpretive tradition, associated most publicly with the writer Zecharia Sitchin, whose series of books, beginning with the 12th Planet in 1976, brought the Sumerian texts to a global popular audience, reads these same records as something considerably closer to historical documentation. In Sitchin's interpretation, the Anunnaki were not theological metaphors, but physical beings of extraterrestrial origin. The creation of humanity was not mythological narrative, but literal genetic engineering. Enki's alteration of the human bloodline was a real intervention whose biological effects we carry in our DNA today. Sitchin's work deserves honest assessment rather than reflexive dismissal or uncritical acceptance. On one hand, he did something genuinely valuable. He took the Sumerian texts seriously as a unified system at a time when popular culture had largely ignored them. He brought the Atrahasis Epic and the Enuma Elish to readers who would never have encountered them through academic channels. He asked uncomfortable questions about the specificity of the creation accounts that mainstream scholarship sometimes preferred to explain away rather than sit with. On the other hand, his specific linguistic translations have been challenged directly and in detail by credentialed Sumerologists. Scholars like Thorkild Jacobson, Samuel Noah Kramer, and more recently Michael Heiser have pointed out that Sitchin's readings of key terms, including his interpretation of the Anunnaki as beings from a hypothetical 12th planet, do not hold up against rigorous philological analysis. The words, in their proper grammatical and contextual reading, do not say what Sitchin claimed they say. That matters. It has to matter. Because if we care about what the tablets actually preserve, we have to care about reading them accurately. And yet, the core question that Sitchin's work raised, whether these texts, with their extraordinary specificity about creation processes, biological mixing, and deliberate alteration of human capacity, might contain some echo of real events encoded in the only cosmological language available to ancient people, remains genuinely open. Mainstream scholarship has not closed it. It has contextualized it, complicated it, pushed back against its more extravagant expressions. But the question itself persists, because the texts keep asking it. What we are left with, if we are honest, is a productive tension. Two serious traditions looking at the same clay tablets and reaching different conclusions about what kind of truth they contain. Literal or metaphorical, historical or theological, memory or invention. Maybe the most intellectually courageous position is simply to hold both possibilities simultaneously, and let the tablets themselves keep asking the question they have been asking for 4,000 years, without rushing them toward an answer they have not yet chosen to give. Let us step back from the tablets now, not away from them. They remain the foundation of everything we have been exploring, and they always will. But back from them far enough to ask a question that the tablets themselves cannot answer. A question that lives not in the archaeological record or the scholarly debate or the careful philological analysis of 4,000-year-old cuneiform, but in you. What if this story is true? Not necessarily true in every literal detail, not requiring ancient spacecraft or surgical laboratories cut into the bedrock beneath Mesopotamia, but true in the way that the deepest stories are always true, as an accurate description of something real about the human condition, as a record that points, however imperfectly, toward an actual event that left actual consequences we are still living inside of. What does that mean for who you are? Because here's the thing that has been quietly building beneath the surface of everything we have explored tonight. The Sumerian account of Enki's intervention is not just a story about the past. If it contains genuine memory, if something was actually placed into the human bloodline that was not originally there, then the consequences of that placement are not historical artifacts. They are present tense. They are operating right now in every human being alive on this planet tonight, including the one listening to this. Think about the restlessness. You know the feeling. Most people do, even if they have never found language for it that fully satisfies. That persistent, low-level sense that you are built for something slightly larger than the life you are currently living. That reaching quality. The way certain pieces of music or certain landscapes or certain ideas produce an ache that feels less like sadness and more like recognition, as if something inside you is responding to a frequency it already knew existed and is simply glad to hear it again. Evolutionary biology does its best with this. Social bonding, survival advantage, adaptive responses to environmental complexity. These explanations are not wrong exactly, but most people who sit honestly with the experience find that the explanations feel slightly too small for what they are describing, like trying to account for the ocean by listing its chemical components. The Sumerian answer is more direct. That restlessness is the divine inheritance in you, resonating with its origin. The modification recognizing what it came from. The Te'ima, that essential divine pattern folded into the human bloodline by Enki in a chamber long before history had a name for itself. Reaching, as it was always designed to reach, toward the larger order it carries the memory of. Think about the hunger for knowledge, not just practical knowledge, not just the information gathering that keeps us fed and sheltered and safe. The other kind. The kind that drives people to spend their lives trying to understand the structure of the universe, the nature of consciousness, the mathematics underlying physical reality, the question of whether existence has meaning, and if so, what kind. The kind of knowing that has no obvious survival value and enormous personal cost, and that human beings pursue anyway, generation after generation, across every culture and every era, without exception. No other species does this, not remotely, not in any way that approaches the particular human obsession with understanding things that do not need to be understood for simple survival purposes. In the Sumerian framework, this too has a direct explanation. Enki is the god of Namzu, deep knowledge, the kind that perceives how things work at their foundation. And what he placed into the human bloodline was not just the capacity for this kind of knowing. It was the drive toward it, the inability to rest in comfortable ignorance, the compulsion to keep asking why, even when why has no practical answer. He built his own nature into us. And then there is the grief, the particular human capacity for a grief that exceeds immediate personal loss. The grief that arrives when contemplating the passage of time, the fragility of beautiful things, the certainty that everyone you love will one day be gone. The grief that shows up uninvited at sunsets and in old photographs and in the particular quality of afternoon light in autumn. Animals experience loss, but this quality, this anticipatory, philosophical, almost aesthetic grief for the transience of everything, appears to be exclusively human, and it is, in the Sumerian framework, exactly what you would expect from a being that carries divine inheritance in a mortal body. A being that is built for timescales it cannot actually live, longing for a permanence it can sense but not reach, the modification reaching toward what it came from and finding the distance unbridgeable. What Enki gave us in this reading was not just expanded capacity, it was expanded longing, the ability to perceive more of what existence contains, and the inability to fully possess it. The gift and the ache were always the same thing, folded together in the clay of that ancient chamber. You carry both of them, every moment of genuine wonder you have ever experienced. Every time a question opened in you that felt too large for any available answer. Every reaching towards something you could sense but not name. Every grief for the beauty of things that do not last. That is not random. That is not evolutionary noise. That is the inheritance doing exactly what it was placed there to do. Reaching, as it always has, toward the stars it remembers. And now we arrive at the part that requires the most courage, not courage in the dramatic sense, not the courage of grand gestures or bold proclamations, the quieter kind, the kind that asks you to sit with genuine uncertainty without reaching for the comfort of a premature answer, the kind that the best scholars and the most honest philosophers have always needed more of than almost anything else. The courage to say, we do not know, because we don't. And the honest accounting of what we don't know about the Sumerian record, about Enki's intervention, about the bloodline alteration and its consequences and its meaning, is not a failure of tonight's exploration. It is, in a very real sense, the most important part of it. So let us sit with what the tablets cannot tell us. The clay is old, older than almost anything else in the written human record. And age, whatever else it does, creates distance. Distance between the event and the recording of it. Distance between the recording and the survival of it. Distance between the survival and the excavation. Distance between the excavation and the reading. Distance between the reading and our sitting here tonight, trying to hear through all of those accumulated layers what someone in ancient Nippur or Eridu or Ur was actually trying to say. At each of those distances, something is lost, something is distorted, something is added by the hands and minds that carried the tradition forward. We are not reading a transcript. We are reading a translation of a copy of a tablet that was itself a scribal reproduction of an older oral tradition whose original form we will never fully recover. Every honest Sumerologist will tell you this. The texts we have are remarkable. They are irreplaceable. They are the best evidence we possess of what these people believed and recorded. And they are incomplete, fragmentary, full of gaps where the clay broke and the words dissolved into illegibility thousands of years ago. Consider how much has simply not survived. The ancient city of Nippur alone, one of the primary centers of Sumerian scribal culture, is estimated to have produced tens of thousands of tablets. We have recovered perhaps a fraction of them. The libraries of Eridu, Enki's own city, the oldest city on earth, largely unexcavated still, sitting beneath the surface of southern Iraq in a region that has seen conflict, instability, and restricted archaeological access for decades. Whatever those tablets contain, whatever records of Enki's character and actions and intentions were preserved in the city most directly associated with him, we have not yet read them. They are there, waiting, as they have been waiting for 4,000 years. And even the tablets we do have present interpretive challenges that serious scholars spend entire careers navigating without reaching consensus. Sumerian is a language isolate, no known relatives, no linguistic cousins to triangulate against in the way that Indo-European languages can be compared and cross-referenced to sharpen our understanding of individual words. Every translation of a Sumerian text involves judgment calls, educated, carefully reasoned judgment calls made by brilliant people who have devoted their lives to this work, but judgment calls nonetheless. When the Atrahasis Epic describes what Enki placed into the human form, the specific terminology used, te'ema, etemu, the nature of the divine blood mixed with clay, carries layers of meaning that do not map cleanly onto any modern conceptual framework. Are we reading about something biological, something spiritual, something that the ancient Sumerians themselves understood as a unified category that our modern separation of biology and spirit cannot adequately hold? We genuinely do not know. And there is a deeper uncertainty beneath all of these textual and linguistic uncertainties. A philosophical one. Even if we could read every tablet perfectly, even if every gap in the record were filled, every broken fragment restored, every disputed translation resolved in favor of the most accurate possible reading, we would still face the fundamental question of what kind of truth these texts contain. The Sumerians who wrote them believed they were recording real events. That much seems clear from the internal tone and structure of the compositions. These are not texts that signal their own fictionality. They are written with the confidence of people documenting what they understood to be actual history. History of a kind that preceded normal human memory. History that required divine transmission to preserve, but history nonetheless. But belief in the historical accuracy of what one is recording does not make the record historically accurate. The scribes of ancient Nippur were extraordinary thinkers. They were not infallible ones. They were working with received tradition, with cosmological frameworks inherited from their own predecessors, with interpretive lenses shaped by their culture and their moment. They may have been preserving genuine memory of real events in the only language available to them, the language of gods and divine councils and cosmic decisions, because that was the vocabulary their civilization had developed for events of ultimate significance. Or they may have been encoding sophisticated theological reflection about human nature and divine purpose in narrative form. And the events described may be entirely metaphorical. Or, and this is the possibility that the honest mind must also hold, the truth may be something in between those options, something that our current categories of literal and metaphorical, historical and theological, real and invented, are not yet refined enough to properly contain. The mystery of Enki's intervention in the human bloodline is not a mystery that more information will necessarily resolve. It is a mystery that points toward the limits of what human knowledge can recover about its own origins, a horizon that keeps receding as we approach it. And there is something appropriate about that, something that feels less like failure and more like the correct relationship between finite minds and questions of this magnitude. We are beings of limited lifespan asking questions about events that may predate civilization itself. We are reading fragments of a record that was never complete, in a language that left no relatives, about events that the people who recorded them had not themselves witnessed but had received from traditions older than their own writing system. Of course there is mystery here, The mystery is not the problem. The mystery is the most honest thing about the whole enterprise. It is the tablets telling us the truth about themselves, that they preserve something real and important and irretrievably partial, and that the right response to them is not certainty in either direction, but patient, humble, genuinely curious attention. The kind Enki himself, if the texts have him right, always seemed to bring to the things he cared about. We owe the mystery at least that much. Let the noise of the day fall away now. Whatever you carried into this evening, the weight of schedules and obligations, and the particular exhaustion that comes from living inside a world that moves too fast and asks too much, let it settle. The way sediment settles in still water, slowly, without force, until what remains is just this, just you, just the quiet, and somewhere beneath it all, the faint and persistent signal of a question that is older than any civilization we have yet uncovered. Who made us this way? Somewhere in southern Iraq, beneath the surface of a landscape that has known war and flood and the slow, patient accumulation of dust across millennia. The tablets are still there, the ones we haven't found yet. The ones that the ancient rivers carried to new resting places before history had a name for itself. The ones buried in the rubble of libraries that burned and collapsed and were forgotten before your great-great-grandparents drew their first breath. They are still there, pressed into permanence by hands that held the same basic architecture as yours, waiting with the patience that only clay possesses, the patience of things that have already outlasted every empire that ever tried to make itself eternal. And on them, in wedge-shaped marks that a reed stylus pressed into wet earth on an afternoon 4,000 years ago or more, are words we have not yet read. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. The full account of what Enki did, the complete record of why he did it, the unbroken testimony of a civilization that watched the first cities rise from river mud and looked at the stars and wrote down what they believed had happened to make us capable of building them. We do not yet have all of it. Perhaps we never will. Perhaps the most important tablets are the ones that time has already erased beyond recovery. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Because tonight was never really about arriving at certainty. You knew that from the beginning, if you were listening with the part of you that recognizes genuine inquiry when it meets it. Tonight was about something older and quieter than certainty. It was about sitting with a story that our species has been telling itself, in one form or another, since the first human being looked up at the night sky and felt that ache of recognition and asked why they were built to feel it. Enki looked at what we were and chose what we would become, whether that is literal history or profound metaphor or something our categories are not yet sophisticated enough to properly hold. The choice it describes is real. Someone, somewhere in the deep grammar of human origins, made a decision on our behalf, a decision that we deserved more than we had been given, that the limitations built into our design were not the final word on what we were capable of, that the distance between what we were and what we could become was worth crossing, regardless of the cost. And the cost was real. The texts are clear on that. Enki did not alter the human bloodline and walk away unaffected. The conflict with Enlil was genuine. The stakes were genuine. The risk was genuine. Whatever this being was, God, metaphor, memory of something our ancestors experienced and encoded in the only language available to them. The story insists that what was given to us was given at a price, which means it was given deliberately, consciously, with full knowledge of what the transgression would cost. You were worth that to someone. Hold that for a moment, not as comfort exactly, not as the resolution of any particular anxiety or grief, but as a fact that the oldest written records of human civilization appear to be quietly insisting on, across 4,000 years of clay and silence and the patient waiting of things that were built to last. Something looked at what we were, saw what we could be, and chose. The restlessness you feel is the inheritance reaching. The hunger to understand is the modification doing what it was designed to do. The grief for beautiful things that do not last is the divine timescale in you, pressing against the mortal one. The wonder, that particular quality of human wonder that stops you sometimes in the middle of an ordinary moment and makes the ordinary feel suddenly, inexplicably sacred. That is the oldest thing in you, older than your name, older than your memory, older than the civilization that taught you the language you are using right now to hold these thoughts. That wonder is what Enki left inside us. Sleep well tonight, and if you wake before dawn and find yourself lying in the darkness with thoughts that feel too large for the small hours, thoughts about what you are and why you are here and what it might mean that existence has the particular quality it has, don't be afraid of them. They are simply the inheritance doing what it has always done, reaching, as it always has, for the stars it still remembers.